Hello everyone, this is Allison and this is the Module 3 instructor video covering the ICD-10 guidelines. This is just an overview of that section. It is not comprehensive. It doesn't cover anywhere close to everything that your textbook covers, but it does cover what I think is most important for us to know this week. So here's the overview of what I'm going to talk about, and fair warning, I will be jumping back and forth between the PowerPoint and the document camera, probably quite a bit. Okay, so just to establish what are the guidelines, the ICD-10 guidelines, they are a companion document to the manual. So I think a lot of people look at the guidelines as kind of arbitrary rules that we have to follow, but they're really more of a map of how to use the actual codes themselves. They're designed to help you effectively and quickly assign the appropriate codes. They change every year to reflect changes to the codes or the way codes are assigned. And I bet you can imagine this year they did change quite a bit because of the advent of COVID. So there are new guidelines each year, but for the most part, the structure stays the same. So where are the guidelines located? They are in the red section at the front of the ICD-10. It's prior to the Alpha Index. And in your manual, it should start on page 1 if you have the Bucks 2021 manual. I will turn the document camera on now so you can see what I'm talking about here. Okay, so here is our ICD-10, and you should already have a tab for the guidelines. But if you don't, it's actually on regular old page number 1. I don't think you can see it, but it's page 1 here at the bottom. And this is where the guidelines are. It's not Roman numeral 1, it's just regular number 1. And the introduction here is actually at the end of this presentation, I will give you some of the highlights that are most important, but there are things in this introduction that you will see on the national exam. So it does have some good information in here. Starting on page 2, there is a kind of a table of contents for the guidelines, and then the guidelines do follow from there. So some of these things you've actually already been learning about and didn't know they were guidelines, but we'll go over that here in a second. But all the guidelines are listed here in red, this red section. And then additionally, when we get back into the tabular, which the tabular is those sections that we have marked with our letters A through Z, when you get there, each chapter has the same guidelines. Now, they're each specific to that chapter, but they're already listed up here in the red section. Just the part that relates to this chapter is here at the front. So everything that's listed in the red section about chapter 1 guidelines is at the front of chapter 1. Same with chapter 2, 3, all the way through. And then I think I've shown you in a previous video. Let's see if I can find an example. So occasionally you will see a little green section in your book, and this is taken from the guidelines and it's related to something in this section specifically. So if there's something from the chapter guidelines that is particularly relevant to this section, you will see it listed in green above. That doesn't mean that sections that don't have anything listed above them have no rules. It just means these are something particular that may be a little bit trickier or more specific that maybe other sections don't usually have. So those are the three places that you will see the guidelines. And I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint so we can talk a bit about how they are organized. Okay, so regardless of what changes they make to the guidelines, they always follow the same format. Section 1 has the conventions, general coding guidelines, and the chapter-specific guidelines. And these are, the chapter-specific guidelines are the ones that we're going to deal with the most. They're the ones that most impact how you code based on each chapter. And so that's what we'll spend most of our time on. Section 2 is guidelines for selecting the principal diagnosis. Section 3, guidelines for reporting an additional diagnosis. And Section 4 is reporting guidelines for outpatient services. And we'll look at all of those. And some of those we've already been looking at. But we'll definitely spend the most of our time throughout this class looking at those chapter-specific guidelines. And that's really the most important part of learning to code and preparing for the national exam is understanding those guidelines and how you use them to find the appropriate code. So occasionally you are going to be referred to a specific part of the guidelines. And I did see this on at least 3 or 4 questions in the national exam. So it's important to understand how to read those references so you know what to look for. It is a little bit confusing if you've never seen it, and if no one's ever showed you how to do it, they'll just throw you a guideline, and then you kind of have to struggle and figure out if you're looking at the right thing. So I just wanted to kind of show you how to do it and hopefully save you some of that stress. So the references are going to follow the table of contents. That's the basic format. So that's what we're going to start with. They start with the broadest section and then narrow down to the most specific section. So if you have ever done an outline, a really detailed outline for a class that has a lot of different points, they keep indenting in on each other, that's the same way the table of contents is set up for the guidelines. So I know that might not make sense if you aren't looking at it, so let's just go ahead and look at it. So this is what the table of contents looks like for the guidelines, and you'll see here they have section 1, and then that's what I talked about is the section we're going to be working in most. That's conventions, coding guidelines, and chapter-specific guidelines. And then underneath that, it has different sections. So conventions is going to be the first one. And then under conventions is even more specific things, format, use of codes, placeholder characters, things we've been talking about already. So all of those are listed in the guidelines. And let me give you an example. So you might get a reference that says, according to 1A 6B of the guidelines, the tabular list, and it'll give you some explanation about what they want you to do with that reference. So that this reference here, 1A 6B, is going to be talking about section 1, letter A, number 6, then subletter B right here. So we're talking about tabular list abbreviations. So you see it starts with the most specific, the section number, the little bit, or the most general rather, the section number, then a little bit more specific, the letter, then the number here, even more specific, and then the most specific is going to be this final letter or number. And we'll try a few out just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So let's try this one. If you saw the reference according to the guidelines 1A4, which section would you need to read? And if you want to pause it, now's a good time and figure out what the answer might be to that. So 1A4 is going to be here, placeholder character. So section 1, letter A, number 4, placeholder character. Okay, so now we're going to do a few of those, and I'm going to switch back to the document camera so I can show you in the actual book. Okay, so we're going to go to the guidelines section. Again, that starts on page 1. And slide it over here so we can see. Okay, and let's see the references I gave you. So the first one I talked about was 1C4A. So let's see if we can find that. So page 1 has A. So we're of course going to be in section 1, as we already said. So 1C, here's A. We're going to want to find, there's B. 1B, okay, we want C. C is up here at the top of this page 2. 1C, so it should be in the right section now. And then 4, so we're going to look under C all the way down here to 4, and that says chapter 4, endocrine, nutritional, and metabolic diseases. And under 4 is going to be A, diabetes. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. So 1C4A. So that's what it says in the content. So let's go ahead and look at the guidelines themselves. So you're going to flip through the guidelines until you can find section C, still in 1, and chapter 1. So we're already in section C because we know C is going to be the chapter specific guidelines. So you can see up here, it says chapter specific guidelines at the top of page 10. So there's chapter 1. We're going to go to 1C4. It's chapter 4. So I would flip through. Okay, so on page 18, we have 1C4. It's chapter 4. And then A, diabetes mellitus. So there we double checked to make sure it matches. That's the same thing. That's what we're looking for. And these would be the guidelines that we're talking about. 1C4A. So right here. And technically, anything underneath A might also be referenced, but then they're going to continue with that reference by saying 1 or 2 or 3, or even further in A, B, C, and so on and so forth. Okay, I'll get you more examples so you can get more comfortable with it. But we're going to call that 1C4A, diabetes mellitus. Okay, so the next one is 1C10B. You want to pause it and see if you can find it. Now would be a good time. Otherwise, we're going to go up to the front. And when you're looking at a guideline, you don't necessarily have to start here. You can always flip through to the guideline if you already know the layout, but I'm just kind of showing you how they've set it up in here. So 1C, so we're getting section 1. Then we're going to 1C, so chapter specific guidelines. Then we're going to find chapter 10, it's over here, 1C10, and then B, acute respiratory failure. So let's go ahead and check and see if that is correct. Okay, so chapter 10 starts on page 24. Here's chapter 10. So we're at 1C10. And then we want 1C10B. So that is going to be here, acute respiratory failure. So most likely, if you were to get this reference, they would then give you another term. So they would probably say 1C10B, and if they wanted to get more specific, they would say 1, 2, 3, or so on. But for now, we're just going to reference that section, which is acute respiratory failure. Okay, we've got 2 more. They're going to get a little bit more specific. Let's see how we do. Okay. So the next one is 1C12A1. That's really specific, right? So if you want to, stop it now, see if you can find it. And then we can start again. So here, section 1, section C, right? 1C12. Chapter 12 is over here, 1C12A. But if you notice here, it stops at A. And I said 1C12A1. So we want to go look at it and see what that says. Then you can flip through. I'm already up here at chapter 16, so I know I'm in the right section. I'll just flip back to chapter 12. Okay. Here's chapter 12, 1C12, 1C12A, 1C12A1, right here. So this matches here. We're in section 1, letter C, which stands for chapter 12, letter A, then under that is 1. So it gets most general down to most specific. So it's going to be pressure ulcer stages. That's kind of hard to say. Okay, so we've got 1 more. So if you want to pause and try it yourself, now's a good time. But we are going to try to do it without starting at the table of contents. So we already know we're in section 1, letter C, the chapter specific guidelines. This is going to be the chapter. It's chapter 16. I'm very close to that now. It's chapter 15. Chapter 16 starts on page 30. Chapter 16, letter B is all the way over here on page 31. And then we're going to go down to, oh, difficult to see, just a second. So down here at the bottom is letter 3, or number 3 rather, and it says Z05 on birth record. So we've gone most general, most specific again. Section 1, letter C, chapter specific. Here's the chapter specific is chapter 16. We're on letter B. So letter A was all the way over here. And then letter B starts here, as you can see. And then number 3. And it's Z05 on birth record. It's the name of that guideline. So whatever they're referencing is going to be this bottom part here. And you can highlight anything you want. But that's the section that they would be talking about. So if somebody said, hey, this is talked about in 1C16B3, you know they are only talking about this little section here that's been highlighted. That's the guideline that they're looking at. Okay. All right, I'm going to flip back to the PowerPoint and we can finish this up. So those are the answers. Again, if you tried to pause it and do it yourself, here's the answers. And you will see these. You will see references like this all the way through on your national exam. Anytime you're coding something new, anytime they bring up a new code or a new coding guideline rather, this is how they're going to reference a new guideline. Okay, so these are the important notes that I wanted to pull out of the introduction to the guidelines. The reason why I think these are so important is because I saw a couple questions, at least one, I believe, was on the national exam that came directly from this introduction, and I didn't know it was there. So I was panicking and guessing when I took this exam. And then later, when I was just casually reading, I saw I had the answer there all along. So I think it would be important for you to highlight these sections in the introduction, or at least just make note of this stuff. Again, I am going to likely make a video, I think before the midterm, about what notes would be most helpful for you so far in the class. And this is probably something I would include in that. If you want to look through that, something I thought was important was the term encounter is used for all settings, including hospital admissions. So any interaction that we're talking about is going to be called encounter. It doesn't mean it's in the doctor's office. It doesn't mean it's in the ER. It's any interaction with the doctor is called the encounter. So that's what we're coding. And then provider is going to mean physician or anyone who's qualified to make that diagnosis. And those are questions that you'll see on national exams, and just good information to know to make sure you are using the right terminology. So that's all I have for this little video. I'm of course going to do additional videos covering more specific things that are actually covered in the guidelines. And in this week's chapter, please look through the chapter as soon as possible so I can make a video about anything you find particularly confusing. I'm thinking combination codes might be something that's a little bit tricky, but I want to make sure I'm tailoring things to your specific needs. So please let me know. Otherwise, have a great week. Thank you.